I'd like to add my welcome to Joe's for all of you to come here today. We are very pleased to be able to co-host this meeting. And I want to also give my thanks to my colleague Joseph Palat for putting this event together. This morning we began with the origin of the IAEA and many references to the elegant speech, Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, and many references in the context for what was really an extraordinary and profound act of the creation of the IAEA represented itself in a post-Cold War still forming order in a Cold War that was unfolding. It was obvious from the remarks of the speakers this morning that from its inception, the agency has played an important role in international security and war and peace. And I think from the headlines today, that remains to be the case today. The focus of this panel is on the evolution of the agency from this time. And I don't think we could have composed a better set of experts to speak on this matter than the ones we have gathered here today. Their perspective is particularly relevant as they were each actively engaged with the agency during arguably its most transformational period in its history, in the 90s in particular, with events unfolding in Iraq and South Africa to follow. It's interesting to me then, as now, the agency continually must respond to many forces, two of which are particularly important, one being the requirements and demands of member states, how they see the agency and their expectations of it, and the other is global events themselves. I mentioned Iraq previously, up through, even Fukushima and Iran today. And so these themes I expect to continue with the speakers we have, the first of which will be John Carlson. John is a counselor at the Nuclear Threat Initiative and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute. Carlson was Director General of the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office from 1989 to 2010. This is when our paths, I think, first crossed in some collaborative work with ASNO. His concurrent appointments included the chairmanship of the IAEA Standing Advisory Group on Safeguards Implementation, SACSI, alternate governor at the IAEA Board of Governors, Sherpa at the 2010 Nuclear Security Summit, and founding chair of the Asia-Pacific Safeguards Network. He received the National Award of Member of the Order of Australia and is a fellow of the Institute of Nuclear Materials Management. John.
Thank you very much, Corey, and good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the Wilson Centre and Los Alamos for the opportunity to be here and to be reunited with so many dear friends and colleagues. I must apologise in advance because a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be extremely well known to most of you, just I wasn't sure what kind of an audience we would have. So I have a lot of background information, but I think at least I can present it in a fairly from an interesting perspective. And you'll see from the title that I want to bring up cultural aspects as well as the obvious technical ones and the political aspects that underlie safeguards. This year being the 60th anniversary of the agency, it also happens to be the 20th anniversary of the additional protocol. So it's a good time to reflect on the importance of safeguards internationally to international security, and in particular the importance of the additional protocol to the effectiveness of the safeguard system. I have a little working definition here, which I'm sure Laura and others would correct me on, but I've got a definition of agency safeguards as being technical and legal measures to verify states' undertakings not to use nuclear material and technology to manufacture nuclear weapons. I think that's a good shorthand for what's a complicated concept. Safeguards have both technical and political objectives. The technical objectives are to ensure that safeguards are effective, to detect any violation, and to provide timely warning if violation occurs. On the political side, to provide assurance of compliance and to deter violations through the risk of early detection. These two aspects, the technical and the political, have undergone major evolution over the lifetime of safeguards, but as I'll discuss, the political and cultural aspects lag somewhat behind the technical. As is well known, safeguards are essential for underpinning the non-proliferation regime. If there was no confidence in that regime, substantial arms reductions and eventual disarmament would not be possible. So it's not simply a question of non-proliferation, of preventing the emergence of further nuclear armed states, but nuclear disarmament amongst those that already have nuclear weapons would not occur if there was no confidence about stability in who possesses and who doesn't possess nuclear weapons. I think it's also important for safeguards to be seen as a mechanism that's very important for the individual state to use if there is a situation of suspicion of that state. In other words, safeguards shouldn't be seen as an adversarial system directed against a state, but rather as a mechanism that a state itself can use for advantage in assuring others of its peaceful intent. The cultural issue in all of this is as follows, and I'm using culture in the broad sense of shared values, shared principles and shared commitments. And the cultural issue is the need to change the perspective from the current prevailing political outlook of that national sovereignty is prime, which I describe as an adversarial perspective, towards one of international collaboration. Safeguards are a cooperative mechanism that can advance both national and international interests. And the national and the international interests are not opposing concepts. The international interest is in fact an aggregation of everyone's national interests. To give you a quick overview of the emergence of safeguards, the first formal expression of the safeguards as a term that I could find was from the 1945 US, UK, Canada Agreed Declaration on Atomic Energy, and that talked about the need to establish effective safeguards by inspections and other means to protect against violations and evasions. Early efforts in the immediate post-war period to establish international control of atomic energy failed, so it fell to nuclear suppliers to develop a system of inspections, and this was done on a bilateral basis. Inspections in this early period were limited to supplied items and materials, and hence the idea of item-specific safeguards. After the IAEA was established in 1957, the bilateral inspection practice was gradually transferred from suppliers to the agency itself. There's also, in this very early period, a substantial influence from the development of Euratom safeguards, Euratom having been established in the same year, 1957, and Euratom in fact was quite considerably further advanced into the safeguards as we know them now, compared with the agency itself. The next major factor in the development of safeguards was the conclusion of the NPT in 1968, and this really moved IAEA safeguards to centre stage in international security. The focus was changed from item-specific to full-scope safeguards, what are now known as comprehensive safeguards. In other words, safeguards that apply to all the nuclear material in the state, with the emphasis on the word all, which has taken some time, I think, for people to understand what that all does mean, all. At the time, I'm not sure that people really understood what they were doing in establishing full-scope safeguards. And it was clear from the outset to those who looked at the language carefully that the IAEA's responsibilities certainly included the possibility of undeclared nuclear material and activities, and the need to carry out verification procedures in relation to that possibility. The language of Article 3 of the NPT is extremely important, has a number of concepts which, as I said, has taken a while for people to understand what they might mean. Article 3 talks about the prevention of diversion, and it talks about, it implies the need for timeliness and the need for the possibility of intervention. In other words, safeguards don't have to follow the event. Safeguards, if they're to be preventative, need to be able to anticipate diversion that is in train, or even diversion that's being planned. Article 3 talks about diversion of nuclear energy, so that the NPT obligation is not limited to material, and therefore neither should safeguards be limited to nuclear material. And Article 3 talks about acceptance by parties of the agency's safeguards system. The system we have today did not exist when the NPT was concluded. InfoSec 153 was not concluded until 2 years after the NPT came into force. So I would interpret that to mean that the safeguard system was not frozen as at 1970, or even as at 1972, that the safeguard system is a system that changes with time. Following the NPT, there's a period of major growth in both nuclear industry and in the safeguard system keeping pace with this. The IAEA, up till the Gulf War, seemed to be doing a highly successful job in coping with the increasing workload and in producing good results each year. The analysis of safeguards effectiveness would show, yes, the agency is achieving goals in inspecting known programs. The mindset at that time was that diversion would necessarily involve declared material or facilities, and diversion in that case would be detected by safeguards, or if diversion occurred outside declared facilities, it could be detected by national intelligence activities. 153 itself had a very significant limitation, that routine inspection access was to be limited to strategic points in facilities. And later events in Iraq show that this was a significant vulnerability. Also in this period, in this growth period, safeguards criteria were developed, which were originally an approach to ensuring that necessary safeguards tasks were carried out, but subsequently the criteria concept was flipped to become a way of evaluating safeguards performance. And the end result was a rigidity in the system and a concentration of effort in the states that happen to have the largest nuclear programs and a lack of attention to areas that were more likely to be proliferation risk. The next major period in safeguards development came after the Gulf War and the discovery of Iraq's clandestine program. This prompted what became known as Program 93+2 to address the weaknesses that had been found in safeguards. In 93+2, which was an international effort, it was the Secretariat in collaboration with member states. It was seen that that information was going to be much more important to making safeguards more effective, and also something had to be done about access rights. The access rights that were given for routine inspections in 153 were clearly not adequate. There was some discussion about whether the Special Inspection Authority in 153 was really enough to give the agency all it would need to address the undeclared problem. And I think the general view was, yes, special inspections provide the legal authority, but there are better ways to go about access. That what was needed was to develop a process or a system for collecting information, and that to rely simply on special inspections, which were by necessity an ad hoc process, would not provide the effectiveness that we were all looking for. So the end result was the negotiation of the additional protocol, what became known as InfoCirc 540, and this was agreed by the Board of Governors in 1997. The focus in safeguards then changed from correctness to completeness, just to pick up some jargon terms. Safeguards conclusions on undeclared activities are clearly much less certain than traditional safeguards. Can we regard the absence of evidence as evidence of absence? That's a very philosophical question. It's clear that trying to draw conclusions on the absence of something is a qualitative judgment. Key issues here include what authority does the agency have? Can it access the locations, information and people as it finds necessary? What capability does it have? What kind of technical capability and what kind of resources? And what's its methodology? Is it correctly developing detection strategies, and is it drawing valid conclusions? So all very complicated issues which even today, 20 years after, are I think I'd describe as a work in progress. I think one thing that's very important here is the standard of proof in safeguards. And if we look at the key documents, the statute itself and 153, we find that there is qualitative language there, or language which is not absolute. So we find terms like diversion of material for purposes unknown. It's not necessary for the agency to prove that diversion is taking place for a weapons program. It's sufficient if the purpose is not clear. And we also find language about the agency not being able to verify diversion, so that the idea there is that the agency if it's blocked from verifying, or if it's in a situation of inconclusiveness, this could be sufficient to make a report to the board. In all of this, expert judgment comes to the fore. I think in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, safeguards had been seen as being increasingly mechanistic, and now there's a major change in emphasis to being able to weigh up and make complex judgments, and this raises questions of how inspectors are trained, how the process is designed, what quality assurance system can there be to ensure the process is being operated properly, and most importantly, and I'll come to this further, is the need to be able to communicate with all stakeholders, with all states, on what is the agency doing, how does it do it, and how does it justify its conclusions. There's clearly need for a high level of communication if safeguards are to provide the confidence and assurance that they set out to provide. Some of the major issues under development include the state level approach. The traditional safeguard system had been based on facility by facility activities, but now we look at the state as a whole. InfoCirc 153 actually points in that direction because it talks about looking at the characteristics of a state's fuel cycle, but traditionally that had not been done. The technique of acquisition path analysis was developed to analyse in great detail what kind of acquisition paths are available to a state, which are the parts of that path that we know about through declarations, what other parts could exist theoretically, and what indicators would there be for finding such activities if they do exist, and how do you develop an optimal safeguard strategy for each state. The idea of what were initially called information-driven safeguards developed. Information-driven has come in for some criticism as a term, and I think now risk-informed is probably the more widely accepted language. Some of the information we're talking about would be for manufacturing of nuclear components. What kind of R&D does the state undertake? Inspectors look at satellite imagery. They look at open press. And also what's become controversial, unfortunately, is information provided by states on other states, including through intelligence activities. This wider net of information is justified on the basis that it helps the agency in drawing sound conclusions about nuclear material, and it improves the probability of detection and the timeliness of detection. A combination of the traditional safeguard system and additional protocol activities has enabled what's called integrated safeguards, which is the optimum combination of measures under both instruments, under the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement and under the additional protocol. The idea being that if part of an acquisition path is covered by the protocol, then there's less reason to also cover the same part under traditional safeguards, so it's possible to rationalise or prioritise inspection effort. And after reaching a broader conclusion, namely that there are no indication has been found of undeclared activities, it's possible to reduce the routine inspection side of the total safeguards effort. Now, to touch very briefly on some current safeguards issues, I think top of my list would be to universalise the additional protocol. As the agency itself has made clear on many occasions, the additional protocol is essential if the agency is to be able to provide assurance on the absence of undeclared activities. The additional protocol is now well established as an essential part of the agency's safeguards system. Just recalling Mark's question of the DG this morning, I think I would disagree with the DG on whether the protocol is part of the system. The agency's own statements about its inability to provide a full level of assurance without the AP speaks for itself. States should not be free to pick and choose which safeguards measures they accept. There should be the same standard for all. And I think the legalistic arguments about whether the additional protocol is voluntary or not overlook the point of it all, which is to be able to provide assurance about the peaceful activities or not peaceful activities in a state. If we look at actual state practice over the last 20 years since the protocol came into being, we find that of all those states that have significant nuclear activities, 90% of those have either got an additional protocol in force or at least have signed an additional protocol. And I think that represents a pretty high level of state practice. There are 6 states, I won't go through their names now, there are 6 states that have not signed, that have significant nuclear activities. There are also a number of states, we had a question this morning about Saudi Arabia, states that are considering nuclear activities and have expressed interest in sensitive nuclear activities, like enrichment, that do not have a protocol in force. And clearly that's an unsatisfactory situation. And I think we all should be giving the highest priority we can to seeing the AP universalised. The next major current issue is the one of the state level approach, and I've linked that together with the use of intelligence information. They're not necessarily linked, but it's convenient to bundle the two together because both those issues are being questioned by Russia at the moment. The Russians, I think not unreasonably, looking at the history of how this came up as an issue, are concerned at the risk that that safeguards could be politicised as safeguards become less technical and more judgmental. It's clearly necessary to ensure that that all judgments and decisions are made objectively, and there has to be a system that that maintains objectivity. The Russians have raised questions about the process. I was at a conference recently in Moscow where the Russian Foreign Minister, Lavrov, actually made the assertion, to everyone's surprise, that the safeguard system is being used to cross-check intelligence information. Now, that was an extraordinary statement, but I think it's of concern that a foreign minister actually believes that to be the case. And I think this represents, amongst other things, a communications failure with what the Secretariat is actually doing. There needs to be a better understanding amongst member states of how the system works, and that means that the Secretariat has to do a much better job in explaining itself. Another issue that's current is what is the agency's role on weaponisation activities? Again, something raised by Russia. in the context of the JCPOA, but implicitly, I think the Russian objection is broader. And here I think we need to recall that the NPT obligations are not limited to nuclear material. The NPT charges safeguards with preventing diversion of nuclear energy, so it implies a very proactive role for safeguards. The agency cannot ignore weaponisation, as the existence of weaponisation activities could indicate that diversion has taken place or is proposed. But on the other hand, there are practical issues here for the agency's work in detectability. There are some things that are very hard for inspectors to detect. An obvious one is use of certain kinds of software. And also there are issues of how to handle sensitive information. And those issues have been addressed. The agency has done this in relation to both Iraq and Libya, and set up special procedures to handle weapons information appropriately. To touch on some future directions, the top of my list is transparency, and the DG this morning talked about the need to maintain confidentiality of information. That's another area where I would disagree. I think 153 is clear that information that is confidential has to be kept confidential. But that's quite a different proposition to saying all the information the agency has to be kept confidential. If we look at some of the newer verification treaties, the Chemical Weapons Convention and the CTBT, we find there are mechanisms there for sharing information with parties. Under the CWC, for instance, state reports, annual reports by states, are made available to all parties. And I think that for confidence building, it's essential that there's a substantial degree of transparency in the way the verification system operates. In the absence of transparency, judicious leaking has always been an important part of safeguards. So the Secretariat is horrified at the concept of leaking, and obviously leaking has problems in the sense of, can you rely on those who are involved in using their discretion as to what they do and don't leak. But leaking has been an important part of letting member states know what's actually happening within the Secretariat, how decisions are being reached, how conclusions are being made, and so on. And I think to have a totally secure system where all information is kept in-house it defeats the purpose, because that way member states don't have a sense of how the system actually works. And I've raised in the past, is there in fact a role for an external safeguards auditor, some sort of entity that can review the information that can't be released, but can review that and give some sort of impartial report to governments about how the agency is actually performing. Part of transparency also, it's not just for the Secretariat, but it's also for states. And this gets back to my point before about the need for culture change, that states should be thinking in terms of, we can't leave everything to the safeguard system, particularly in the area of undeclared, where absolute conclusions can't be drawn. It's important for states to be transparent to the agency and to be transparent to each other. So states should look at how can they disseminate more widely information about their nuclear activities, how can they involve greater collaboration, which gives insights from other states. Privatisation of nuclear activities is distinct from having nuclear programs run by state entities, particularly military entities, is extremely helpful in providing assurance, and the concept of multinational fuel cycle centres, so I think will be of some importance in the future. cultural change. As I said before, political attitudes have not kept pace with the evolution that we've seen at a technical level. We need to move away from this adversarial perception, and we need to move away from legalism. Safeguards should be a collaborative activity, and the international interest should be seen as being paramount in all of this. A final point I'd raise under future directions are new verification missions, and I won't go into any details on that, but in fact the statute gives the agency very wide possibilities. Essentially the agency can apply safeguards, whatever safeguards mean, at the request of a state unilaterally, or at the request of a group of states parties to an agreement. So there's a very wide scope to invite the agency to do things like verify transfer of nuclear material out of military programs, or even, as a flag there, something, the possibility would be confidence building measures for naval fuel. Another area for the future would be greater use of monitoring, innovative technologies, and to look at better information sharing across verification regimes, something that was touched on briefly this morning. So to conclude, oops, have I gone too far? Yep. To conclude, the safeguards system is a unique model of treaty verification, and it has quite successfully evolved to meet very challenging circumstances. We've seen it move from inspector observations in its earliest form to the development of material accountancy and the bundle of activities that support accountancy, the development of instrumentation and unattended monitoring, and now to the emphasis on information analysis. As these challenges have become more complex, safeguards themselves have become more qualitative, but political attitudes are still lagging behind. And this is shown by the resistance to universalising the AP, and it's shown by the current questioning of the state level approach and the use of information. The resolution of these issues and the development of an appropriate culture for safeguards requires much greater engagement at leadership levels, as well as engagement by us, the expert community, in raising a broader awareness and appreciation of safeguards as a subject. And that I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Well, despite your advice to move away from legalism, we'll turn to our second speaker, who's best known as the legal mind of the IAEA, Laura Rockwood. Laura is the executive director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nonproliferation. Laura is well known in the international nonproliferation and disarmament community, having worked for almost 30 years at the IAEA, where she worked primarily on negotiation, interpretation, and implementation of IAEA safeguards. She served in the Office of Legal Affairs of the IAEA, from which she retired as section head for nonproliferation and policy in November of 2013. Prior to working for the IAEA, Rockwood was employed by the U.S. DOE, Department of Energy, as a trial lawyer and as counsel in general legal matters. Laura.
Thank you very much, Corey, and it's a distinct pleasure to be with all of you here today. I'm speaking on a slightly different topic. I was asked over the weekend to step in for Tero Barduranta, the DDG for Safeguards, on the evolution of safeguards. And since I've spoken frequently on the evolution of safeguards, and I've worked for 7 DDGs, I figured that was probably okay. So my starting point on the evolution of agency safeguards and the nuclear nonproliferation regime is that it has come about as a function of states need for individual and collective security, and the threat that is posed to that security by the spread of nuclear weapons. And it has evolved as a function of shifting perceptions as to where that risk is coming from. And what I will do is walk through successively shorter periods of time and discuss how states' perception of security needs have changed over the years and how safeguards have responded to it. The first 25 years, there was a great deal of activity, starting with the creation of the IAEA and ultimately ending up with the opening for signature of the NPT. Now, back in the early days, there was money to be had, there was business to be made, and while some of these things may have come true, not all of them. But what it was characterized was by this period we heard about from a couple of speakers about supply arrangements. The technology holders figured if they hung on to the technology closely enough, they could make sure that the technology receivers didn't misuse it. So eventually, I believe, in the interest of security, perhaps the United States and its allies felt confident that they weren't misusing the technology, but it probably didn't leave a warm and fuzzy feeling in the hearts and minds of people from other countries. So what was the risk that needed to be addressed? It was the possible misuse of supplied material and items. And so the world community responded in a number of ways. First of all, the technology holders insisted they would exercise unilateral restraint, but that the world needed an international verification body that was actually capable of developing a system for verifying the non-misuse, if you will, of supplied material and items. And as we all know, this ended up with the creation of the IAEA through its statute. And there are 3 provisions in particular, as a lawyer, I wanted to bring your attention to. The first is Article 3A5, and John just referred to that. There are 3 circumstances in which the agency is permitted to apply safeguards. They are in connection with agency assistance, pursuant to a bilateral or multilateral arrangement, such as the NPT, Nuclear Weapon Free Zone treaties, and to any of the activities of a state at its request, which is one of the reasons when asked, does the agency have a possible role in disarmament verification, I absolutely believe there is a legal case to be made for it. It's up to the member states, but I believe it is within the scope of the statute. And finally, the second provision had to do with Article 12, which we've heard from Myron earlier today, and it identifies what the drafters back in the 1950s thought safeguards should consist of, including on-site inspection, anytime, anyplace access, reports and record keeping, and what to do in the event of non-compliance. Now you'll notice that I've italicized the anytime, anyplace access, which is interesting, sort of tracking independently Myron. It is not the way safeguards work, but I highlight it because in my view, it reflects the urgency and that the states who became party to the IAEA treated the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Imagine, this was negotiated at the height of the Cold War. Try to get a treaty with that kind of language in it today. I doubt that we would. And importantly, the definition of nuclear material, source and special fissionable material, about which all of you here are certainly well informed. Now, when I first came to the IAEA, I absolutely knew nothing about safeguards. So my safeguards inspectors said there are 2 ways to look at safeguards. And first of all, you start with nuclear material, and you need a lot of it. And one of the nuclear materials you need is HEU. And in order to do that, lucky for us in the verification business, it doesn't grow on trees. You actually have to produce it. The other material is plutonium. And again, doesn't grow on trees, so you have to actually produce that and reprocess it. So my response in those days was, well, why don't we just ban the production of HEU and PU? Well, it gets complicated because you can also use it for civilian purposes. Okay, so it's not as easy as I thought. Now, John just mentioned the item-specific safeguards agreements, and this is pretty much what it looked like back in the early days. There were a lot of gaps. As I said, these are not non-proliferation agreements. They were simply no misuse safeguards, all right? But even as we're getting to the end of that first 25-year period, we're seeing a shifting perception of the risk. It's not just about supplies anymore. It's about states developing indigenous capabilities to produce nuclear material on their own. Now, this also coincided with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the rise of the very first nuclear weapon-free zone in an inhabited territory, the Tlatelolco Treaty. So you already see a shift from supplied-focused safeguards to the need to have comprehensive safeguards that cover not just the supply, but the production of nuclear material. Now, the next 2 decades, same size slide, probably a few more data points on there, starting with the entry into force of the NPT, and closing out those 2 decades with the Strengthening Safeguards program. What were the challenges of this period, from the 70s to the 80s? It is the misuse, the possible misuse of indigenous nuclear material. And how did the world community respond to that? By developing a safeguard system for verifying not just supplied but produced nuclear material, and requiring export controls for nuclear material and single-use items. The theory being, if you control the single-use items, they can't develop an indigenous fuel cycle without somebody catching them. So, as you all know, we had to create this safeguard system, and I have an antique copy of IMCIRC 153. And in that is one of the most principal foundations of NPT safeguards, that the state agrees to accept safeguards on all source or special fissionable material in all peaceful nuclear activities within its territory, under its jurisdiction, or carried out under its control anywhere. So, good enough for that. What was the agency's role? Well, it was twofold. It is the timely detection of the diversion of significant quantities of nuclear material to the manufacture of nuclear weapons, nuclear explosive devices, or for purposes unknown. This gets back to the standard of proof, the burden of proof with respect to safeguards. The agency doesn't have to prove there has been a diversion to a nuclear weapons program. It just has to be diverted for purposes unknown. Now, the other aspect is deterrence through the risk of early detection. If your safeguards are good enough, states aren't going to try to cheat. The other point that John made, and we heard earlier, is there are 2 ways to divert. And I make this point because so many people think of diversion as the misuse of declared nuclear material. And this was a popular misconception, particularly prior to the 1990s. So here's our routine safeguards coverage with comprehensive safeguards agreements. It looks pretty good. We filled the gap for HEU and plutonium. Okay, there were some aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle we didn't feel was necessary under safeguards. Basically, small quantities of nuclear material. You know how scientists are. We don't really need to safeguard that. But even as we're coming to the end of this 20-year period, we were already coming to terms with some of the limitations in traditional safeguards. Routine access, limited in terms of where the agency can go and how frequently. As I said, nobody worried about small quantities of nuclear material because you can't make a bomb out of it. We were focused on declared materials, that is to say the correctness of states' declarations, but we were not providing assurances of the absence of undeclared nuclear material and facilities apart from the non-misuse of research reactors. So this was about to change, and there was something that helped that. This is the war that changed everything. On August 2nd, Iraq invaded Kuwait. A week or so later, the 4th NPT Review Conference was convened. And although there wasn't a final document agreed, it wasn't because of safeguards. I think we had just about everything agreed ad referendum in main committee too, including language encouraging the Director General to look at a study on new safeguards approaches, to look at safeguards in the nuclear weapon states, and importantly, urged the agency to conduct a study on special inspections, not surprisingly. So the next 10 years, again, this is half that time period, but there are a considerable number of important data points in here, including the discovery of Iraq's nuclear weapons program. South Africa, much to everybody's surprise, becomes party to the NPT, and by the way, has nuclear weapons that it dismantled. North Korea finally brings its safeguards agreement into force, and very shortly thereafter is caught for cheating on it. We have the US DPRK agreed framework. We have the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty happened in this period. The approval of the Model Additional Protocol, the expansion of nuclear weapon free zone treaties, and India and Pakistan come out of the closet and said those tests, those were actually nuclear weapons tests. So then we had the 2000 NPT review conferences, just an overview. But what really caught member states' attention was Iraq. And this, I'm sure many of you have seen. This is a line diagram of Tuatha. This is what we thought Tuatha included. I'm sorry the colors aren't best for this kind of room. But there were 3 facilities and a location outside of facilities where we went to, Ollie, was it once a year or twice a year? Twice a year, I think, right? Well, imagine our shock and dismay and surprise when after Resolution 687, we picked up on a few other activities that were going on under the very noses of our inspectors. Everything from soup to nuts that you'd want in a nuclear weapons program. And what did they do? They used small quantities of nuclear material, and they went shopping. They went and bought their own dual-use items and brought them back and created their own single-use items. So we see a shift in the perception of the risk. What do we now need to focus on? Possible undeclared nuclear material and activities. How did states respond to that? First of all, they insisted that we ensure that the verification of all nuclear material and activities was possible, whether declared or undeclared. And they expanded their export controls to cover dual-use items. You know the agency is not an export controller. As a matter of fact, member states have been pretty religious about avoiding communications with the agency on that matter. But in that early days, the DG, Hans Blix, asked me to look into the agency's right of access to use special inspections, if you will, to follow up on indications of undeclared nuclear material and activities. And unencumbered by experience or knowledge as I was, my first point of reference was to read 153. My second point of reference was to pick up Myron Kratzer's negotiating history of 153 and to write a memo that said, but of course we have that right. What do you think special inspections are all about? And one of my favorite comments that Myron once said to me, what is it about the word all that people didn't get? Because that right and obligation shows up in every single comprehensive safeguards agreement. What we did is we didn't initially change the system, but we redefined the objective. What the states wanted from us was assurances of correctness and completeness of states' declarations. Iraq, I frequently referred to as the come to Jesus moment of the member states of the IAEA. But there were some other things going on during this period. We weren't just working on strengthening safeguards. There were a lot of other things going on. First of all, the intensive inspection activities in Iraq, the verification of the dismantlement of South Africa's nuclear weapons program, and the conclusion by North Korea of its safeguards agreement, along with the conclusion, I got them a little bit confused. This is Mr. Yoon. He was the one who negotiated North Korea's safeguards agreement. And then we had the conclusion of the Argentina-Brazil Safeguards Agreement. All of this within the period 91 to 93. It was a pretty busy time. But even more importantly, with the decisions that were taken by the board and the GC that confirmed the agency's right and obligation to verify completeness. Now, most people here are pretty convinced that this is within the agency's right and obligation, but it horrifies me to this day to hear member states, people in the Board of Governors, challenge that fundamental principle. So I started including this slide in my presentation. There's the September 91 resolutions by the board and the General Conference asking the DG to verify the completeness of South Africa's declarations. There's the famous decision on special inspections that Myron shared with us this morning, where the board reaffirmed the agency's right to use them to ensure that all nuclear materials are under safeguards. And finally, one of my personal favorites was the board's decision in a closed session on North Korea in February of '93, where they determined on the basis of a new technology we used, environmental sampling, allowed us to pick up an anomaly using satellite imagery from national technical means, which helped us identify where we needed to look. We went to the board and asked for confirmation that it was essential and urgent for the agency to have access to undeclared locations for the purposes of verifying the correctness and completeness of the state's declaration. All in one fell swoop. This is a perfect example of how, if hard cases make bad law, good cases make great law. So we decided to start looking at strengthening safeguards. And of course, as you know, we had two parts, those that we thought we could already conveniently do under the existing legal authority, and the types of things that we thought would require additional legal authority. Now, I don't know, maybe I should duck, but I included a picture in here of someone who should be in this room with us today, Rich Hooper. He was actually the brains behind 93+2. I was his faithful sidekick lawyer, but he was the brains behind 93+2. Eventually, after some years and a long process, which is a subject of a separate presentation, over a period of 11 months and 4 meetings of Committee 24, we were able to conclude the model additional protocol. But frankly speaking, it wouldn't have happened without a little help from our friends. The first session that we had on the model additional protocol of Committee 24, from the 2nd to the 4th of July, go figure, 1996, we were barely able to fill the time allotted. We did quickly a first review of the draft, and then everybody pretty much sat around and looked at each other and said, well, I guess we need to go home now. The second session, which ran from the 1st to the 10th of October that year, it seemed that the additional protocol was drowning in quicksand, and the rats were beginning to jump from the ship. We had Germany, Spain, and Belgium on one side, and the United States on the other. It was going nowhere fast. What happened during the third session, which was for 10 days in January of '97, seemed like nothing short of a miracle. It was an orchestrated ballet between the United States and Germany. Rich Hooper and I, who had been sitting up at the front of the room, looked up from our ongoing game of hangman and sat back in wonder watching this happen. Unbeknownst to any of us, this extraordinary turnaround had come about as a direct result of a phone call from President Clinton to Chancellor Kohl, and one-on-one meetings over lunches, dinners, and visits between Norm Wolfe and Reinhard Loesch over the intervening Christmas period, hence the Christmas elves. So without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. Now, each one of the provisions in the model additional protocol has a story behind it. Each of them has a different explanation. But suffice it to say that for every lesson we learned in Iraq, South Africa, and North Korea, there's a corresponding measure which is related to elements of information or types of locations. What's new? Additional information, a new kind of access, complementary access, simplified administrative measures. What is not new? The agency's right to carry out unannounced inspections, the agency's right to request access to undeclared locations, and fundamentally, the agency's right to verify correctness and completeness. The additional protocol only gives the agency more tools to do that job better. Back in the early days, I had an argument with Mohammed. Mohammed was saying, well, we can't draw a conclusion. We didn't used to call it the broader conclusion. We can't draw a conclusion regarding completeness unless they have an additional protocol. And I said, be careful. You better not say that. I mean, you better not say that we won't. It is not legally possible, because we still have a lot of states who don't have additional protocols, like North Korea, for example. And you don't want to put yourself in a box of having to argue that just because you don't have an additional protocol, you don't have the authority to investigate undeclared. So we've developed language over the years. It's still not without its ambiguity. But the point is the agency chooses not to draw the broader conclusion unless it has the benefit of the credibility offered by an additional protocol. So now I guess we can all go home because we've solved that problem. We hadn't quite solved the problem of the SQP, but I'll touch on that in a minute. But we did start developing our conclusions for comprehensive safeguards agreements. No need to repeat it. You know what it is. And even though we formulated the language differently in the early SIRs, it was basically the same approach to integrating the 153 measures with the AP measures, and then possibly being able to revise the safeguards approach. Well, there was another event that took place on a really beautiful Tuesday afternoon in Vienna. We had just sat down to resume the afternoon session of the Board of Governors when we heard over our headsets that 2 planes had crashed into the World Trade Towers. The irony of this was that we had just started discussion of the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and whether to address nuclear facilities, nuclear material in international trade. Well, just imagine if those planes had chosen a reprocessing facility or a reactor to fly into. So the last decade, I'm going to run through this, didn't get any smaller, and there's some pretty significant events. In addition to 9/11, you had the Trilateral Initiative, North Korea agreeing to inspections, not agreeing, agreeing, and not agreeing. So a little bit of a yo-yo. We were able to bring our inspectors back into Iraq and sadly had to remove them 4 months later. I was pleased when David Kay said we were all wrong. What he forgot to say was, except for the IAEA. So the challenges of the last decade are really about non-state actors and the risk of not just nuclear material, but other radiological materials. And we've been trying to improve physical protection, nuclear security since then. And a quick slide on the difference between safeguards and security. Safeguards, detection and deterrence of diversion of nuclear material by a state. Nuclear security, detection and deterrence of misuse of nuclear material and other radioactive substances by non-state actors. Well, the next few years were a little busy too. We had our meetings in the Security Council on Iraq. We had, this is one of my favorites, the Iran deal with Ali and his counterpart. We have the signing by Libya of its additional protocol, the discovery of AQ Khan's network and other black market networks, the facility formerly known as a reactor, and of course North Korean activities. But The good news was we actually modified the small quantities protocol to make it harder to qualify and easier for it to go away. One of my favorite slides, however, was the Nobel Peace Prize, because Mohammed paid me the honor of inviting me to attend this wonderful event. And I like to point out that I had my friend Selma Hayek and Bob Geldof there as well. Of course, you recognize this guy. He was chairman of the board at the time. So, just real quickly, the present and beyond. I don't think we're out of the woods yet, although we've come some distance. We have had this very, very divisive debate over the state level concept. I'm hoping that things are starting to calm down now. We had the November 2011 annex on possible military dimensions in Iran, and it was followed by the new negotiations. I don't need to go into the details of the JCPOA. Most recently, we now have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So where are we going? Well, I think we still have quite a few challenges facing us. Nuclear black markets, US-Russian relations, is it a new Cold War? The disarmament slowdown, like it or not, that's what it's perceived as by the non-nuclear weapon states. Is the JCPOA going to last? Is North Korea going to start a nuclear war, intentionally or inadvertently? Or, for that matter, is the US going to? And what are the challenges to the credibility of safeguards when you have countries like Ukraine, which does not have control over all of its territories? I think we need to be incredibly mindful about the conclusions we draw so that we don't undermine the strengths that the ways we've, the improvements in safeguards since the 1990s. So this is a little bit about what today's regime looks like. How it's going to look like tomorrow, I suppose, is anybody's guess.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, and I should thank you as well on short notice, completing our panel, given the DDG Varjaranta having to take leave of us. But
My pleasure.
with that, I'll turn to our final speaker for this panel. And I would note, since we did start late, we will finish late to give more time for questions at the end of the remarks here. But Pierre Goldschmidt is a non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was the Deputy Director General and head of the Department of Safeguards at the IAEA from May 1999 until June 2005. Before joining the agency, he was Director General of Senatum, the company responsible for the fuel supply and spent fuel management of 7 Belgian nuclear power plants for 12 years. He was a member of the Directorate of Eurodiv, and he is a member of the European Nuclear Society's High Scientific Council and has headed numerous European and international committees, acting as chairman of the Uranium Institute in London, the Organization of Producers of Nuclear Energy in Paris, and the Advisory Committee of the Uranium Supply Agency. Pierre.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if I had to choose the most exceptional year in the history of the IAEA safeguards regime, it would be 2003. As you know, the year started by the DPRK's notification on January 10 that it was withdrawing from the NPT, a unique case so far in its history. On March 20, the US-led coalition forces invaded Iraq on the pretext that the country still had nuclear weapons of mass destruction, or including nuclear weapons program. A few weeks earlier, on February 25, IAEA inspectors discovered at Natanz a pilot enrichment facility, centrifuge enrichment facility, ready to start operation, as well as the existence of undeclared nuclear material. And on December 19, Colonel Gaddafi announced that Libya was abandoning a covert nuclear weapons program running for some 20 years. And as a result, the IAEA discovered the existence of a vast international network of clandestine nuclear traffic headed by Dr. A.Q. Khan of Pakistan. Yet, the safeguards regime still has not adequately adapted to this series of development, which signaled the need for institutional reform. After the first Gulf War in 1991, the world realized that the IA lacked the necessary tools to verify that Iraq's or any other non-nuclear weapon state's declarations were not only correct but complete. As a result, the agency Board of Governors, as was told many times today, in 1997 approved the Model Additional Protocol that was designed to remedy that major weakness of the safeguards system. It is disturbing that no comparable measures were adopted after the events that took place in 2003. I will focus the following analysis on the cases of Iran and North Korea and the lessons not yet fully learned 14 years after these events. There are three major lessons that we should draw from our experience in Iran when a state is found in non-compliance with its safeguards agreement. Lesson 1. In case of non-compliance, the IAEA must refer the case to the Security Council without undue delay. In November 2002, IAEA Director General Mohammed El-Baradei said, I quote, "I believe that while differing circumstances may necessitate asymmetric responses, in the case of non-compliance with non-proliferation obligations, for the credibility of the regime, the approach in all cases should be one and the same, zero tolerance," end quote. When non-compliance is detected by the Safeguards Department, time is of the essence. Any non-compliant state should know that it will be referred within a short period of time, first to the Board of Governors and then to the Security Council. If it proactively cooperates with the agency to correct the situation, it should be referred to the Security Council for information purpose only, as was the case with Libya. If by contrast, the state in non-compliance adopts, and I quote, "a policy of concealment without cooperation being limited and reactive and information being slow in coming, changing and contradictory," end quote, as was the case in Iran, the issue should be reported without delay to the Security Council for action. In the case of Iran, in its very first resolution adopted by consensus in September 2003, the Board of Governors called on Iran, and I quote, "to suspend all further uranium enrichment-related activities pending provision by the Director General of the assurances required by member states and pending satisfactory application of the provisions of the additional protocol," end quote. The resolution also called on Iran to grant unrestricted access, including environmental sampling, for the agency to whatever locations the agency deemed necessary for the purpose of verification of the correctness and completeness of Iran's declaration. The problem with a resolution such as this is that it is not legally binding. The only way to make it legally binding is to have it adopted by the Security Council acting under Article 41 of the UN Charter. In the case of Iran, such a resolution was adopted for the first time only in December 2006. 3 crucial years had been lost, making the situation practically irreversible in the sense that a lasting suspension of enrichment was no longer achievable. Lesson 2. In case of non-compliance, the IAEA should temporarily have expanded verification authority. Experience has taught us, in particular in the case of North Korea and Iran, that when a state is found in non-compliance with its safeguards agreement and does not show full transparency and cooperation in resolving questions and inconsistencies with regard to its nuclear program, both past and present, the agency will temporarily need expanded verification authority. In fact, this basic principle is clearly reflected in IAEA's report of September 2005 on Iran, where it is stated, I quote, "Given Iran's past concealment efforts over many years, such transparency measures should extend beyond the formal requirements of the Safeguards Agreement and additional protocol and include access to individuals, documentation related to procurement, dual-use equipment, certain military-owned workshops, and research and development locations. Without such transparency measures, the agency's ability to verify the correctness and completeness of the statements made by Iran will be restricted, end quote. The problem is that these additional transparency measures have not been defined in any precise way, and when they are requested under an IAEA Board of Governors resolution, they are not legally binding on the non-compliant state. These broader access rights must not include military sites, since it is likely that the military or related actors would be involved in nuclear activities associated with a nuclear weapons program, should one exist. Lesson 3, the Security Council should adopt a generic resolution preventively dealing with cases of non-compliance. To give the IAEA the verification tool it needs in case of non-compliance, the Security Council should adopt a generic resolution stating, independently of any specific case, that if a state is found by the IAEA to be non-compliant, upon request of the IAEA, the Security Council would automatically adopt a state-specific resolution requiring that state to temporarily grant to the agency extended access rights. These rights are defined in the Model Temporary Complementary Protocol, TCP, that was published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in April 2009. These rights would be terminated as soon as the agency secretariat and the Board of Governors have drawn the so-called broader conclusion that there are no undeclared nuclear material and activities and that the declarations are correct and complete. This generic resolution should also require the non-compliant state to, first, immediately suspend all nuclear fuel cycle related activities as long as the IAEA has not been able to draw the broader conclusion, and also conclude with the agency within a limited period of time, say 60 days, a facility-specific safeguards agreement for all its nuclear facilities. The latter requirement is necessary to close the most damaging comprehensive safeguard agreement loophole, as I will explain in a moment. By failing to find Iran in non-compliance in November 2003, the IAEA board created a damaging precedent with far-reaching consequences that are still felt today. At that time, Iran had no operating UF6 conversion plant, no operating centrifuge plant at Natanz, and the construction of a heavy water research reactor at Arak had not even started. By the time that in early 2006, the IAEA finally reported Iran's non-compliance to the Security Council, the situation was very different, and there was no way Iran could be compelled to return to the status of its nuclear program as it was at the time of the IAEA November 2003 report. This fact is reflected in the JCPOA concluded in July 2015, which allows Iran, inter alia, to continue enriching uranium. Some of the constraints accepted by Iran under the JCPOA during the first 15 years go, in fact, beyond what I thought achievable. However, if for the US 15 years might seem a long period since it represents nearly 4 presidential terms, for Iran and many others, this is really not a long period. It will soon be 15 years since we first came to Natanz. There is little doubt that around 2030, if not before, Iran will be a nuclear threshold state. That is, a state capable, in my definition, of manufacturing more than one nuclear weapons in a period of a few months and having the necessary delivery means. With that in mind, while the negotiation of the JCPOA was underway, I recommended privately in March 2014 to high-ranking officials the inclusion of 2 important provisions. The first is the requirement that Iran places each of its nuclear facility under IAEA facility-specific safeguards agreement. The second is the requirement for Iran to ratify the CTBT, as was requested under Security Council Resolution 1929 in June 2010. Neither was included in the JCPOA. It is hard to understand on what basis Iran could have objected to these two crucial requirements, since Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has issued a fatwa stating that the production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons is forbidden under Islam, and paragraph 3 of the JCPOA's preamble states that, I quote, Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons, end quote. Of course, the fact that the US has not yet ratified the CTBT might have been an obstacle to the inclusion of that requirement in the JCPOA, but Iran could have cleverly linked its ratification of the CTBT to that treaty's ratification by the US. There are three further major lessons that should be drawn from our experience in North Korea. In case of NPT withdrawal, the Security Council must act promptly and decisively. In April 1993, the IAEA Board of Governors declared that North Korea was in non-compliance with its safeguards agreement and promptly reported the case to the Security Council. For a period of 13 years thereafter, the Security Council failed to adopt a single resolution condemning North Korea, even during the 3.5 years that followed its withdrawal from the NPT in January 2003. It is only after the DPRK tested their nuclear weapons in October 2006 that the Security Council finally adopted a legally binding Chapter 7 resolution. But the response came much too late, and the sanctions imposed were much too mild to dissuade North Korea from carrying on its nuclear program. Since then, as you know, North Korea tested nuclear weapons in 2009, 2013, twice in 2016, and most recently in September of this year, and has launched numerous and ever more capable ballistic missiles. The main factor that led to this dramatic situation is that for all those years, China consistently opposed effective UN Security Council sanctions against Pyongyang. China's justification was that it feared that harsh sanctions could precipitate the collapse of the regime, thereby opening the door to hundreds of thousands of North Korean refugees into China and increasing the likelihood of the reunification of both Koreas under the leadership of the democratic South. Although China's concerns are perfectly legitimate, the consequences of its unconstructive and ineffective attitude is that today North Korea has an arsenal of nuclear weapons, which it is unlikely to abandon in any circumstances in the foreseeable future. In any case, it is more than time to adopt new measures to minimize the risk that other states could one day follow DPRK's example. One should not forget that in May 2006, the Iranian parliament threatened in a letter to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to force the government to withdraw from the NPT if the United States and its allies continued pressuring Tehran to suspend uranium enrichment. And similar threats were made later on by key Iranian officials. Lesson 5, the Security Council needs to deter NPT withdrawal by making the use of the veto right less likely. As exemplified by the cases of Iran and North Korea, one of the greatest difficulties in deterring states from violating their non-proliferation undertakings or from ignoring legally binding Security Council resolution is their hope that for geopolitical or economic reasons, at least one of the 5 veto-wielding members of the Security Council will oppose the adoption of effective sanctions. As a step towards strengthening the non-proliferation non-proliferation regime, the Security Council should adopt a generic and legally binding resolution stating that if a state notifies its withdrawal from the APT, which is quite undisputed right under its Article 10.1, such notification constitutes a threat to international peace and security. This generic resolution should make sure that under these circumstances, the Security Council would meet immediately with a view to decide under Chapter 7 which measures would apply as soon as the withdrawal becomes effective. This generic resolution should also include a statement by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that they consider the withdrawal from the NPT to be such a major threat to international peace and security that in such a case they do not intend to exercise their veto right against any state-specific resolution sanctioning the withdrawal state if they are the only permanent member to do so. Such generic resolution would not deprive the 5 permanent members of their veto right on any state-specific resolution. What it would achieve is to make sure that the Security Council will consider the matter without delay and increase the risk of immediate sanction for the withdrawing state. Lesson 6. All states should make irreversible safeguards an export condition. One of the main outstanding safeguards loophole that deserves prompt attention is the absence of a requirement for IAEA safeguards to irreversibly remain in force should a state leave the NPT. If one day Iran or any other NPT non-nuclear weapon state decides to withdraw from the treaty, its comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA would automatically lapse under the terms of that agreement. As a result, a state may withdraw from the NPT and use previously safeguarded nuclear material and facilities to produce nuclear weapons without violating any international treaty. As a result, NPT members should therefore strengthen safeguards rules and practices by creating a legal requirement to maintain safeguards even if a state exercises its right to withdraw from the NPT. Over the past 15 years, a number of states and organizations have submitted proposals designed to close that significant loophole. However, none of these proposals, if adopted, would have created an effective legal barrier to a state's utilization of previously safeguarded facilities and material for military purpose after its withdrawal from the NPT. Indeed, it seems unrealistic to expect, as the Nuclear Suppliers Group does, that a country deciding to leave the NPT and expel IAEA inspectors would thereafter agree to enter into a facility-specific safeguards agreement with the IAEA, return previously delivered material and equipment to the supplier state, or accept inspectors from the exporting state to conduct verification work that IAEA inspectors are no longer allowed to do. It would be much more effective to require state to conclude a facility-specific safeguards agreement with the IAEA before any material or technology are transferred, rather than as a bilateral and limited fallback obligation after a state has withdrawn from the NPT. Members of the NSG should formally agree to interpret their effective safeguards in perpetuity criterion as requiring the recipient state to have an IAEA facility-specific agreement that does not lapse if the state withdraws from the NPT in force before enrichment or reprocessing related equipment, technology, or expertise is transferred. NSG non-nuclear weapon states should lead by example and place all their enrichment and reprocessing facilities under facility-specific safeguards agreement with the IAEA. By virtue of the current roster of NSG members, if this approach could be achieved, nearly all non-nuclear weapon states that are parties to the NPT and currently operate enrichment and reprocessing facilities would have endorsed this new mechanism. The only exception would be Iran. Nuclear weapon states should also lead by example when it comes to their own facilities in order to demonstrate commitment to the principle of irreversible safeguards. Each nuclear weapon state should agree to place any enrichment or reprocessing facility which is on the list of its eligible facilities under INF 666 type safeguards agreements. And now, whether we like it or not, it is likely that in the future, an increasing number of non-nuclear weapon states will acquire the necessary scientific, technical, and industrial capability to manufacture nuclear weapons and their means of delivery, thereby becoming nuclear threshold states. It is therefore crucial to adopt without delay the measures necessary to deter nuclear threshold state from going one step further, that is, manufacturing nuclear weapons and then withdrawing from the NPT. Deterrence can be effective only if states believe that non-compliance has a strong chance of early detection and if its detection has immediate consequences. To this end, members of the Security Council should discuss and agree on legally binding generic procedures for responding to both non-compliance and NPT withdrawal. If adopted, the measures recommended in this paper would make a real difference in protecting against nuclear proliferation and should be adopted now in order to mitigate the consequences of the next potential proliferation crisis. Protecting against that dangerous prospect is in everyone's best security interest. And as we know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Ladies and gentlemen, George Bernard Shaw once said, "The only thing we learn from experience is that we don't learn from experience." Over the last 12 years, I've been preaching in the desert along the lines summarized in this paper. Considering my age, I am unlikely to continue this work much longer. I therefore think of this paper as my last will, and hopefully, where there is a will, there is a way. I now rely on others to take over. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how to end that, but no final last remarks anyway. But this is an oasis here in the desert, so we're happy to have this. Actually, I'll begin as we did before. If any of the panelists have a question for each other, please take the floor.
Not a question, but John, leaks?
Well, that'll have to come up at the break. So we'll have, I think we'll try and get back on schedule a little bit, but still have 20 minutes or so for some questions. I think, as we did before, if you would identify yourself and your institution before you make your short, brief question, we'll try and get as many questions to the panel as we can. I'll collect them nominally in groups of 3. Yes.
Henry Sokolsky with the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you for this panel. 2 questions. I saw on a timeline a strange event. It was Chernobyl. I don't know what it was doing there, but Fukushima didn't make it. For some reason, Chernobyl made it, but not Fukushima. The question is, the evolution of the system, I think one or both of you, 2 of you said, somehow should reflect the urgency of security concerns. Would it also follow that maybe that Chernobyl point and the Fukushima point that wasn't there is also something to consider, which is perhaps the demands for nuclear power and nuclear energy as a major solution has kind of receded a bit. And does that play at all in how the system might evolve? I mean, there may be less demand for the things causing problems. Second question for any of the panelists is, can you make a distinction? Some of you talked about timely detection. Some of you talked about timely warning. Is there a distinction? And some of you mentioned the word monitoring, and some of you mentioned the word safeguarding. In my mind, these are different things. I'm curious how the panelists think about these four words.
Thank you. Myron? Thank you.
Okay, Myron Kratzer, and I have no institutional connection. Well, thanks. Pierre, you mentioned a lot of things, and I think you amended about half a dozen international treaties. But one of the things that you did point out was, I think your words were the unquestioned right of withdrawal. I'm not sure that there is an unquestioned right of withdrawal. It seems to me that the language in the NPT dealing with the question of withdrawal was very carefully drawn. It sets up some criteria for withdrawal, and seems to me that the easy and correct way to a lot of the proposals that you've made is to start using the language of the NPT in that way. In other words, to judge withdrawals on the basis whether the criteria were met, criteria whether there was a specific incident, criteria whether the supreme national interests of the country have been affected, and so on. That might be an easier and better way to get to it. Secondly, I want to ask Laura, one of your charts, I think, said that we have the right under 153 to go anywhere, and I think you agreed with that.
Mm-hmm.
Down below, I think on the same chart, it said broader access. How can that be? If you already have complete access, how do you have broader access under the...
Outer space.
Okay, I have a short question for John, because this is an equal opportunity. John, my recollection of the safeguards conclusion that are drawn each year is that if the additional protocol is in effect, you can draw the broader conclusion of everything is under. If it's not in effect, you can only draw the limited conclusion that declared material is under safeguards. I think both of those are dreadfully misstated. I don't think you can ever draw the conclusion that everything in a state is under safeguards. But even more importantly, I think the worst thing you can say to an inspector is, fellas and ladies, there are women inspectors, I assume. Fellas and ladies, don't try too hard when there's no advanced protocol in effect, because we've already decided you can't make any judgment about it. That's wrong. That's the wrong way to go about it.
Thank you. And one more here in this room.
Paul Schultz, University of Birmingham. Can I mention a canonical, a non-canonical case? The unmentionable building at Al-Kibar, which seems to be difficult to talk about even now. A case where the IAEA did not get involved, and yet it seems to have been exactly the kind of thing that the IAEA is set up to deal with. And I don't blame the IAEA about this from what I know about it, but could the panel please comment on the implications of that? What does it mean that an organization which theoretically has unlimited access can't visit a place, but the Israeli Air Force eventually has to? What prevented the IAEA playing a significant role in this case? How significant is that? Is it likely to happen again? And if, as I suspect, it's linked to the UNSC, as Pierre has pointed out, what would you say, Pierre, or others, are the chances that the UNSC will do any of those things that have been proposed? And if there were a disciple who was going to follow your work, Pierre, how would he work? How would he push the change that you see as necessary in the UNSC? what would be the method and the arguments and the leverage that there might be to get them to do all those worthy things?
Very good. We'll start try and respond to Henry Sokolsky's questions. Anyone like to take the issue of demand and the change with how that affects safeguards implementation?
Yeah.
Laura?
I think that was directed at my slide. Normally, I do have the Fukushima event in there, but one of the reasons I put Chernobyl in there was because this is normally a much broader presentation, and in my view, Chernobyl was to safety what Iraq was to safeguards, what 9/11 was to nuclear security. It's really to convey the point that no good crisis should go wasted. You know, there's each one of these events got the state's attention and compelled the international community to do something about it. I think what Fukushima did is it created a different response, and that was in many countries to draw back from their grand nuclear power demands. And yes, I think there has been a reduction in immediate demand for it. Maybe that will go back up. It's really hard to say. But I recall hearing this question raised before, and the answer being there are still a lot of facilities out there, even if they are no longer operational. There's still a lot of nuclear material out there. So yes, there does seem to be an immediate reduction in demand. Who knows how stable that curve is? I just don't know.
Any comments on timely detection versus timely warning?
Well,
John?
I'm happy to do that one. I think they're very closely related. The point of being able to provide timely detection is to provide timely warning. As I said in my presentation, the timeliness of the warning is that it should be given in time to enable international intervention to stop the state from succeeding with a weapons program. So clearly, if detection takes place too late for warning and intervention, then it's failed.
Not timely.
And we see with DPRK, 13 years seems to be the number of timely.
No.
Very.
Yeah, okay, there was early detection.
Yes.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
using the word
Yes.
early detection.
Yes, no, only making a point about the Security Council's role, but
That's a different.
now turning to Myron's questions, I think we'll work down the row here from
Well,
Pierre.
Myron, I said that withdrawal was an undisputed right under Article 10.1, so under the terms of Article 10.1. Now, let's be realistic. There was a question. The question was not clear when the PRK announced its withdrawal, and there was a discussion whether did they comply with all the requirements. They didn't announce to every state like it was done. It was not clear if it was really in the supreme national interest. But it is also said that it's to the state to declare or to determine whether it's in its own supreme interest, not to anyone else. So, of course, that's a weak point. And I think it was wrong for the international community, IAEA included, to wonder whether the PRK was in or out or not. I mean, after 90 days of its notification, it was clear that it was out in all practical terms. And therefore, the only state-specific, the facility-specific safeguard should have, the IAEA should have implemented that or tried to implement it. In any case, they probably would have failed. In the case of Iran, I mean, you don't need a lot of imagination for them to find out a good explanation for why it would be in their supreme interest to withdraw from the NPT, especially in the present circumstances where you have US pressure, sanctions, not nuclear related, okay, so far. But still, I don't think it would be very difficult knowing the Iranians' creativity. On Paul Al-Kibar, yeah. That's it's a very interesting case. It's a very special case too. your question is why, in fact, why did Israel bomb Al-Kibar instead of informing the IAEA that there was a undeclared nuclear facility in construction there? Maybe, most likely, it's because after the experience in Iran, they felt that the consequences of just informing the IAEA and hopefully or possibly the agency finally going there, whether it was a visit or whatever it would be, a special inspection, they would say, okay, there is effectively indeed a facility under construction there, like it was for Natanz. And then Syria would have said, okay, yeah, we should have declared it. But we didn't do it because we didn't have nuclear material already in the facility, so we were not obliged to do it. I don't remember if they had the new code 3.1 at the time.
I think so.
I think so.
Yeah.
So, okay, they would say, okay, we were wrong, but now it's declared, so we are going to carry on. And once it's declared, it's there. There's nothing you can do to prohibit a state to construct a research facility, a nuclear power plant, a heavy water research reactor. And of course, that's a risk. And therefore, if Israel wanted to make sure that this would not happen, it was better to bomb it before informing the IAEA. It's a special case, but it's certainly an important one.
Laura?
I hope everyone will agree with me.
Laura, John, anything to add on Al-Kibar?
On Al-Kibar, the original statement isn't correct. The agency did get involved. But I must, and I have expressed this to the Israeli officials, that I found that the premature bombing of the Al-Kibar reactor was a profound vote of lack of confidence in the IAEA. And it disturbs me greatly because the next time you need the IAEA to be credible, that it's just not going to be as believable. So I think it was a profound error to have done what they did and prevented us from getting the reactor and having it under safeguards or taking some other action. So my personal...
Laura, do you agree that if they had informed us, Syria could have continued building the reactor?
Quite possibly.
Okay.
Quite possibly.
Okay.
But there's nothing illegal with building a reactor.
No, exactly.
Myron, you raised another question about go anywhere and broader access. Far too shorthand on a slide. Yes, I do agree that under special inspections, it allows the agency to request access to undeclared locations in the state if we need to. What I meant by broader access in the context of the additional protocol is we have much broader access on a regular basis, on a routine basis. So for example, routine inspections might be limited to a nuclear facility, but under the complementary access, we have the right to go to anywhere on the site of a nuclear facility. So both special inspections and Article 5C of the additional protocol allow the agency to request access to undeclared locations. The bar is just a lot lower under the additional protocol than has become the bar for special inspections. So,
Thank you. John, on the conclusions.
Yeah, I'd agree with Myron completely that in relation to undeclared activities, the agency can't give an absolute assurance. All it can say is that it's carried out its procedures and found no indication.
Yeah.
In the case of a state without an additional protocol, the range of procedures that the agency can apply are very limited. And therefore, clearly, the conclusion that the agency can give is a lot less than the conclusion it can give where there is an AP and it is able to go through the full suite of activities. So I'd agree with you that the inspectors should still look for indicators of undeclared, and of course under 153 safeguards it does anyway in terms of the flow through a facility as to whether any of that might be undeclared material. but clearly it can't give the same kind of conclusion as it can with an AP, and with an AP, it's always got to be very careful, and the audience, states have also got to be very careful to understand exactly what it is that the agency is concluding, because it's certainly not an absolute assurance that there are no undeclared activities in the state.
Very good. Actually, with that, I've got 2 names on the list, and I'll have to close it off there in the interest of time. I've got Mike Rosenthal and then Pete de Klerk here.
Thank you. Just one comment. On the attack on the Al-Kabar reactor, I don't agree that it represented a profound lack of confidence in the IAEA. It might represent lack of confidence in the Security Council, but more to the point, I think, is in certain circumstances, one would not want to wait until the reactor went critical and an attack meant spewing radioactive material around the region or even locally. And that's perhaps a more important point than the other. I do have a question for John, though. You mentioned in one slide that the safeguard issues were becoming more complex and that qualitative judgment, and I couldn't tell whether you meant followed from that or desirable or not. I take a little bit of exception to whether there's more complexity, but it would seem to me that the safeguard system would be much better off to the extent that it become more objective, more precise, take better advantage of better modern technology to draw better conclusions and become more credible and not give the appearance of relying on subjective or less objective judgments about things. Thank you.
Pete? One moment.
Both this morning and this afternoon, we've talked a lot about special inspections and not giving away the rights that the IAEA had from the beginning. And my question to all panelists is, also thinking of what Dan Poneman said this morning and Pierre's thesis, should the IAEA in retrospect have asked for a special inspection in Iraq in, say, 1989 and in Iran, say, in 2003? Thank you.
Thank you. On Michael's question on...
One, and what would then the scenario be if that would have been done?
On the question of objectivity or subjectivity in the agency. John?
Well, I think my point, Michael, was that with currently available tools, trying to make a judgment about the absence of something has to be judgmental. If the tools improve, then perhaps you can get to the level of precision that you'd like, or we'd all like. But I can't really see that there's any escape at the moment from saying we've done this conclusion represents our best judgment based on the information available to us. But it's a judgment, so it's not an absolute conclusion based on unassailable facts.
And finally, special inspections. Pierre, do you want to take a cut at that? Iraq and Iran.
Well, Iraq in '89 was before my time, so I would leave it to Ollie or Laura to answer that one. I don't know whether it would have been more effective. In fact, I think the IAEA didn't know about in '89 about the undeclared program. It's only after the first Gulf War in '91 that everyone knew. I don't know whether the agency at that time had information, but clearly it was not actionable information as far as I know, so they couldn't have asked for a special inspection, I believe. In Iran in 2003, again, in 2003, I don't think it would have brought much help. I think we did a lot in Iran in 2003. You just have to read the November 2003 report and all the things we discovered without a special inspection. And you have to read the terms. We just did it before this meeting of special inspections. You have to discuss it with the state. First, you have to tell why do you want a special inspection. So you have to say, I'm concerned about something very precise, and I want to go there to verify that this exists or does not exist. And then the state can argue and say, no, you cannot do that because of whatever reasons. And then you say, no, I really need to go there. And then you go to the board, and then you go to Article 18, and it can go on and on. So by the time finally you go there, unless there is nuclear material, the likelihood that you find what you were looking for will not be there. The case could have been used for Parshin, for instance, but if you have fast cameras and things like that that are used for nuclear weapons related activities, this could have been disappeared by the time we went. So the DG at the time said in Iran, we prefer to use visits. Yeah, so we want to visit the point, and it didn't make a big difference. It doesn't mean that special inspection should not have been used after the Kibar event in Syria. There, I think, yes, we should have, when Oli, it was not my time, when Oli wanted to go back many times after and couldn't do it. At that time, a special inspection should have been required. But
Very quickly,
that's
Laura.
Very quickly, first of all, special inspections, you need to remember, can involve either access to additional locations or additional information, and we forget about that. But what's interesting is those things that we did do that weren't routine or ad hoc inspections, by definition, were special, because it says an inspection shall be deemed to be special when it is either additional to the routine inspection effort, blah, 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 that involves access to information or locations in addition to the access specified for ad hoc or routine inspections. So by definition, they were. The sorry thing is we didn't call them special inspections. And you can second guess that or not. There's always a fine balance any prosecutor has to make about how you pursue a case. Do you get involved in a legal debate about special inspections and what the inspectorate can or cannot do under a special inspection, or you get the damn job done? Now, I'm a little bit more on this side than just get the damn job done, but I understand why those decisions are made.
Very good. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And to get us back a little bit on schedule, it'll be a short break. Let's reconvene at 4:10, if you would. 4:10. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.